October 12, 1944, Norfolk Naval Base. 47 German women, prisoners of war, stepped onto American soil braced for the world their leaders had promised them, a nation of softness, of chaos, of teetering economic collapse. What they found instead froze them in place. The horizon was not empty. It was a jagged forest of steel, an impossible fleet of warships stretching into the Atlantic haze. The air itself trembled, a physical vibration of industry that seemed to resonate in their bones, the scream of machines and the percussive slam of giant cranes moving like metallic beasts. From sprawling factories, tanks and planes poured forth in a torrent so ceaseless it defied counting. One woman, her face pale, whispered a single, hollow word. Unmöglich. It's not possible. This can't be real. They had been bred on the myth of American weakness. What they witnessed was a power so absolute it felt like an accusation. And that first shocking moment on the dock would shatter everything they thought they knew about the war. Stay with us to see how this revelation unfolded. And if you value history told with unsparing truth, please subscribe, like, and support our work. Your help allows us to unearth more hidden stories just like this one. The morning of October 12, 1944, was sharp, the air scoured clean by an Atlantic wind that carried the metallic tang of salt and welding fumes. As the SS Bremer eased into its berth at Norfolk, its steel hull stained with the rust of a long, anxious voyage, the 47 German women prisoners huddled on deck. Captured across the collapsing fronts in France and Belgium, these technicians and auxiliaries clutched their thin coats against a chill that was more than just the weather. Nazi propaganda had been their gospel. America was a land of decadent comforts, a hollow giant incapable of the brutal calculus of total war. But when the gangplank thudded against the dock, that gospel began to unravel. The sound hit them first, not chaos, but a symphony of relentless purpose. The clang of hammers on hull plates rang with the terrifying rhythm of cathedral bells, steady and unending. Diesel engines coughed plumes of black smoke as cranes, immense and deliberate, lifted crates the size of small houses onto waiting rail cars. Then came the smell, an overwhelming assault of tar, hot grease, and brine. For women accustomed to the managed scarcity of the Reich, it was the smell of obscene abundance. One of them, a woman named Ingrid, would later scribble in a secret diary, "We expected emptiness. We found a harbor more crowded with warships than Hamburg in its prime." The paradox was a physical blow. Before their boots even touched American soil, they were encircled by the evidence of a war machine that dwarfed their most fevered imaginings. This single yard at Norfolk employed over 40,000 men and women, launching a new Liberty ship every 4 days. By the war's end, American shipyards would deliver over 2,000 such vessels, 71 of them. The number was a quiet obscenity, a figure that dwarfed Germany's entire wartime naval production. A U.S. Navy lieutenant escorted them down, his tone formal but devoid of the expected hostility, a quiet civility that only deepened their unease. The women's boots clattered on the concrete, their eyes darting from the lines of soldiers standing at ease to the dizzying backdrop of cranes, cargo nets, and half-built hulls. The silence among the Germans was a heavy, brittle thing, broken only by the rhythmic slam of shipyard machinery. For the Americans, this was just another Thursday. For the prisoners, it was a revelation. They noticed the small things, details that screamed of unthinkable plenty. A convoy of trucks idling nearby, their fuel tanks full, their canvas tarps new. Pallets of fresh uniforms stacked waist-high. For a people who had been rationing soap and sugar since 1940, these were signs of a nation not even stretching to fight. One prisoner whispered to another, her voice tight, "Distel, it's not possible." Another clutched her scarf tighter, bracing against something far more dangerous than the wind. This was not a performance, not a Potemkin village arranged to intimidate them. It was simply America at work, and that mundane reality unsettled them more than any propaganda film ever could. A Red Cross observer noted in his report, the women seemed disoriented, less by their capture than by their arrival. The docks themselves appear to have communicated a power greater than force of arms. As they were guided towards waiting buses, they caught a final glimpse of the horizon, a forest of iron masts and smokestacks stabbing into the gray sky. It was an image of industrial fury none of them would ever forget. But this was only the beginning. Their journey inland would take them deeper into the heart of a contradiction, past evidence even more staggering than the docks of Norfolk. And with every mile, the chasm between what they had been told and what they could now see would grow wider, deeper, and more terrifying. The convoy rolled out of Norfolk just after noon, the olive-drab buses rattling along a coastal highway streaked with sea salt. Inside, the German women sat in a tense, simmering silence, their gaze fixed on the passing landscape. They had been conditioned to see scarcity everywhere. Instead, mile after mile, America revealed itself as an arsenal without end. The second shock came within minutes. The shipyards didn't end at the harbor. They stretched for blocks, smoke and steam billowing from gantries as welders sent fiery cascades into the air. Rows of Liberty ships stood like skeletons, some mere ribs of steel, others nearly complete. A young signals officer among the prisoners, a woman who had memorized German naval tonnage tables, whispered in disbelief, "One yard here has more hulls than all of Kiel." The numbers proved her right. In 1944, American yards were producing 18 million tons of shipping annually, 6 times Germany's entire wartime output. The rhythm of hammers and rivet guns became an industrial heartbeat, pulsing through the bus windows. As they moved inland, the docks gave way to factories. Smokestacks marched across the horizon. Sprawling warehouses bore names they vaguely recognized from intercepted documents: Ford, DuPont, Bethlehem Steel. One prisoner later recalled, "It was as if every town was a barracks, every street a supply line. We realized then our newspapers had lied. This was not a soft, distracted people. This was a nation organized for war." The paradox was everywhere. The roads themselves were a revelation, choked with trucks hauling crates, tanks, and parts. Gasoline, a substance so precious in the Reich that doctors biked to hospitals, flowed here in a ceaseless tide. As the convoy slowed, they could smell it, the sharp, sweet fume of petrol hanging in the autumn air. Sergeant James Foster, one of a pair of American drivers, overheard a prisoner gasp at the sight of hundreds of trucks lined nose to tail at a depot. He just muttered to himself, "Lady, that ain't even half of what's on the road today." For him, it was mundane. For them, it was a miracle. At a rest stop near Newport News, the buses idled beside a rail yard. Long lines of boxcars stood ready, their destinations, Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, scrawled in white chalk. The sheer, clean orderliness of it all was unsettling. In Germany, logistics were a chaotic scramble against Allied bombs and constant shortages. Here, the process was a relentless, efficient machine. The prisoners, several of them trained analysts, exchanged silent, knowing glances. The frequency of trains, the volume of material, the neat stockpiling, it all pointed to an enemy whose resources were functionally infinite. One scribbled in a hidden notebook, "We thought America was a land of consumers. It is a land of producers. Every factory we pass is another nail in our coffin." And yet nobody flaunted it. American civilians went about their lives, children playing by the roadside, women carrying groceries. There was none of the hollow-eyed exhaustion that defined German cities in 1944. How could a nation wage a global war while still feeding its people, clothing them well, laying down new highways, as if peace had never left? By the time the convoy neared Richmond, The women were no longer whispering. The initial shock had curdled into a slow, dawning horror. What they had seen in a single afternoon surpassed what Germany could produce in a year. The propaganda that had sustained them, that America was soft, divided, incapable, was dissolving like frost under the Virginia sun. But their journey was not over. Ahead lay the camp itself, where an even more disorienting paradox awaited. Their captors would treat them with a dignity that would feel like the cruelest weapon of all. The buses turned off the main road at dusk, gravel crunching as they approached a sprawling compound ringed with barbed wire. The women braced themselves for what propaganda had promised: filth, brutality, cages. Instead, as the gate swung open, another illusion shattered. Before them lay neat rows of wooden buildings that looked less like a prison and more like a college campus. Smoke curled from chimneys, carrying the impossible scent of baking bread. Beyond the barracks, they saw tidy gardens and a field marked for recreation. A nurse named Hildegard muttered, her voice thick with disbelief, "Impossible. They live better here than our own soldiers at the front." Inside, the shock deepened. Each prisoner was assigned a number, photographed, and issued fresh bedding. Then came the medical inspection. Dr. Elizabeth Crawford, a Navy physician, was brisk and professional, checking teeth, listening to lungs, and noting the clear signs of malnutrition in nearly every case. "You've been living on 1,200 calories a day, maybe less," she remarked through an interpreter. "Our men get twice that, even in the field." The contrast was humiliating. Back home, rations were thin slices of black bread and watery stews. Here, even as prisoners, they were measured for proper shoes. Ingrid wrote later in her journal, "They treat us like patients, not enemies. It is an insult and a mercy, both at once." The paradox was relentless. In their barracks, clean cots with wool blankets awaited them. Soap and towels were stacked by the washroom. A Red Cross representative explained their rights under the Geneva Convention. The Germans stared, dumbfounded. Their own government, a signatory to those same conventions, allowed Soviet and French prisoners to starve in open fields. The numbers told the story starkly. German POWs in American camps received an average of 3,500 calories daily, more than many American civilians. Allied prisoners in German camps often survived on less than 1,000. If Berlin knew the truth, one prisoner confessed in a hushed voice, they would never forgive us for surviving so well. The sensory details became indelible memories: the smell of clean linen, the taste of white bread with real butter, the solid clatter of stainless steel cutlery. In one corner, a woman broke down, sobbing, after biting into an orange, a fruit she had not seen since 1939. "To us," she whispered, "this was a luxury beyond reason. This wasn't indulgence, it was discipline. The guards were firm, and escape was not tolerated. But the civility itself was a weapon, a quiet demonstration of a nation so confident it didn't need to be cruel." As one U.S. officer remarked, "We can afford to treat them well. We are not afraid of them." That first night, as the women lay awake listening to the low hum of a generator, some found the first uninterrupted rest in months. For others, it was torment. To be shown such humanity by the enemy made the brutality of the Reich harder and harder to justify. But what they had seen so far, the harbor, the factories, the barracks, was only the surface. Soon they would hear the invisible pulse of America's power, a network of voices crackling over radios and telephone lines, revealing a coordinated war effort that defied imagination. The day began with a bugle call, sharp against the autumn air. After a breakfast of eggs, toast, and coffee that tasted like a memory of a forgotten life, the prisoners were escorted to a common hall. And there they heard it, the open pulse of American communications. Radios hummed, telephones rang, the steady clatter of typewriters filled the air. For these women, many of them trained in signals and logistics, the sounds themselves were a revelation. They leaned forward, their ears tuned to the static of a shortwave set. Through it came clipped English voices, weather updates from Kansas, shipping manifests from New Orleans, naval traffic off the Pacific coast. The astonishing part wasn't the information, it was its openness. A former radio operator named Lotta whispered, "They don't even bother to hide it. They broadcast to the world because they can." In the Reich, secrecy was armor. Paranoia governed every transmission. Here, the sheer transparency was both baffling and terrifying. A U.S. Army sergeant, noticing their rapt attention, explained casually, "Just routine. We've got thousands of stations, thousands of lines, every state, every base, every ship, we're all connected." He shrugged as if it were nothing. For the prisoners, it was everything. Germany's fragmented network, crippled by bombing, could barely communicate across its own shrinking empire. The statistics were staggering. By 1944, the United States military operated over 400,000 telephones, with tens of millions more in civilian hands. The entire Reich had fewer than 2 million functioning lines, most in cities already reduced to rubble. Touching a telephone, seeing a letter carried freely, it was, as Ingrid recorded, like feeling civilization again. And yet this was the very freedom they had been taught to despise. The steady buzz of switchboards, the metallic snap of plugs, the whir of teletype machines, it was a symphony of efficiency. This invisible infrastructure, they realized, was a weapon as decisive as any tank. Wars weren't just fought with rifles, they were won with coordination. "I had believed America was disorganized, lazy," Hildegard the nurse confessed later. "Instead, I saw that even their voices had order. The war lived in every telephone line." The most rattling part was the normalcy of it all. If this was the background noise of a single camp in Virginia, what must the full network of the nation sound like? That night, the paradox weighed on them. The Reich saw secrecy as strength. For America, transparency was power, and soon the proof of that power would become brutally, terrifyingly visible, not in whispers and signals, but in steel wings and roaring engines that would shatter their last illusions. The first thing they noticed was the smell. A thick, industrial perfume of oil, rubber, and high-octane gasoline that clung to their clothes for hours. The bus pulled up beside a corrugated hangar, so enormous its open doors seemed like the mouth of a metal god. Inside, wings gleamed under overhead lamps as teams of mechanics swarmed over fuselages with a terrifying rehearsed precision. In the minds of these German women raised on the myth of Luftwaffe superiority, their Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs were still unmatched. Yet here, in the open, stood rows of American bombers and fighters, not by the dozen, but by the hundred. A sergeant named Michael O'Brien, a cheerful Irish-American with grease-stained sleeves, escorted them onto the hangar floor. "This one here," he said, slapping the flank of a B-24 Liberator, "can be replaced in 3 days if it's lost. 3 days, ladies." The words landed with the force of a physical blow. 3 days. In Germany, aircraft factories lay in ruins. A single lost plane was a national tragedy, its replacement taking weeks if it could be built at all. The numbers behind O'Brien's boast were obscene. In 1944 alone, America produced 96,000 aircraft, more than Germany built during the entire war. A new plane rolled off an assembly line every 5 minutes. The sound made the statistics real. The rhythmic pounding of rivet guns echoed like machine gun fire, but instead of destroying, it created. The very floor vibrated with industry. Lotta, the radio operator, muttered, her voice trembling, "So many, and still more coming." It wasn't fear of the guards, it was awe at the sheer scale of the machine that was crushing them. "Our leaders told us America was weak, unwilling to sacrifice," Hildegard wrote in her journal. Yet here, Sacrifice was invisible. It was just production. The casualness of it all was the most unnerving part. Workers joked and shared cigarettes as though they were assembling tractors, not weapons of war. How could a people so relaxed produce such overwhelming force? O'Brien, sensing their shock, leaned in with a grin. "You think this is big? You should see Detroit. This is just a drop in the bucket." He chuckled, leaving them in a stunned silence. For the Reich, every lost plane was a wound. For America, it was an accounting entry to be corrected in days. That single difference decided the war. As they were led back outside, the roar of an engine test firing shook the ground, a sound that followed them onto the bus, a prophecy rattling in their bones. But their education was not over. Soon they would be shown photographic proof that this industrial might was not theoretical. It was reaching deep into the heart of Germany, and it was tearing their world apart. 3 weeks passed, a strange limbo of routine meals and medical checks. The German women had grown numb to the sounds of American life, but the blow that finally broke them came not from a sight or sound, but from a set of black and white photographs spread across a wooden table. An intelligence officer, his tone measured and calm, tapped a photo of the Luna Works near Mersburg. "This," he said, "produced most of Germany's aviation fuel, or rather, it used to." The after image showed twisted steel and shattered pipelines. The women leaned in, their faces grim. They had been told Allied bombing was random and ineffective. Here was the evidence of a precise, calculated, and relentless campaign. One photo after another hammered the point home. A ball-bearing plant in Schweinfurt reduced to rubble. Bridges across the Rhine snapped like twigs. A prisoner named Marta whispered almost to herself, "So that is why our trains never arrived." The statistics were even colder. By mid-1944, Allied bombers were dropping 200,000 tons of explosives on Germany every single month. American losses were high, but the hangars they had seen proved those losses were sustainable. The Reich, meanwhile, was bleeding out. "I could almost smell the smoke rising from the paper," one woman wrote. What shook them most was the clinical detachment of the officers. This wasn't theater, it was daily analysis. To the prisoners, each photo was a dagger to the heart. To the Americans, it was just data. "We don't need to destroy everything," an officer explained without malice. "Just the fuel, the bearings, the bridges. When those are gone, your armies can't move." "It was not hatred that defeated us," Ingrid wrote that night. "It was arithmetic." German propaganda had painted America as reckless. What they saw was cold, disciplined annihilation. As they walked back to their barracks, the sky was streaked with the contrails of training aircraft. For the first time, it felt as though the very clouds belonged to the enemy. But this new, terrible knowledge raised a moral crisis. Should they cling to the lies their country was dying for, or should they accept a truth that felt like betrayal? The question would come to a head with the arrival of a single, smuggled letter, a final test of their loyalty in a world where loyalty had become meaningless. The letter arrived on a gray afternoon, a flimsy piece of paper slipped under their barracks door. It was from another German POW camp, smuggled through a prisoner network. The women crowded around as Hildegard, the nurse, read the hurried script aloud. "Hold fast. The Reich is pushing back. New weapons will change the war. Do not believe what they show you. Victory is near." The words were the same hollow promises they had heard for years. After the hangars, after the photographs, they rang with a desperate, pathetic echo. "If we were winning," Lotte, the radio operator, said flatly, "they would not need to write this." But Hildegard smoothed the paper. "Still, it is what our families are being told. What if they believe it, while we know?" The tension was a living thing in the room. Now this letter, this ghost of a dying ideology, was forcing a choice. That evening, an American lieutenant entered their barracks. He held an intercepted copy of the letter in his hand. "You don't have to believe me," he said, his German halting but clear. "But you should know, we do not show you lies. We don't need to." He then laid a fresh set of photographs on the table, rail depots in Frankfurt, obliterated, columns of smoke over Hamburg so vast they seemed to touch the sky. The contrast between the smuggled plea and the photographic proof was absolute. For the first time, a prisoner named Greta, silent for weeks, spoke up, her voice firm. She tapped a photo with a trembling finger. "If Germany has such weapons, why do they not stop this?" The silence that followed was the sound of a faith breaking. The letter had been meant to sow resistance. Instead, it had crystallized their despair. The question was no longer what to believe, but how to live with the truth. That truth became undeniable in the spring of 1945. Newspapers left in the common room announced the fall of Cologne, of Dresden, of Frankfurt. Then, in April, the final whisper came: Hitler was dead. The 1,000-year Reich had collapsed. Ingrid wrote in her diary, "We came here as soldiers of a nation that believed itself destined to rule. I see now we were children fed stories while America was building a world beyond our comprehension." As the U.S. Army prepared them for repatriation, a Red Cross officer asked Ingrid to carry an official report back to the German authorities. Her account was brief and brutal. "America's strength is not a lie. It is everywhere, in their machines, their factories, their food. To continue this war is madness." When their ship docked in Bremerhaven, her report was met with predictable fury. German officers called her a traitor, a woman seduced by enemy propaganda. But for the women who had been with her, the truth was irrefutable. They had seen the planes roll from the lines. They had eaten the food. They had walked streets free from fear. What they carried back was not just a memory, but a measure, a living contradiction to the myth of the Reich. Years later, they would speak not of humiliation, but of a brutal awakening. They recalled the clang of shipyard hammers, the endless rows of tanks, the shocking freedom of a nation that did not fear its own people. They had arrived as prisoners of a regime that called itself invincible. They left as witnesses to its delusion. In the end, America's greatest weapon wasn't its bombs. It was its abundance, its relentless capacity to create, its simple, overwhelming proof that a nation built on freedom could and would outbuild any tyranny. They had come as conquerors. They left as students, and that was the final, most devastating defeat of all.